Last week, we talked about the hardest, easiest challenge that you will ever face. This week, we're talking about how to have a successful leadership transition. After decades of nonprofit leadership impacting thousands, we hit a wall. We started asking ourselves, how can we go beyond our personal success and leave a legacy that lasts far beyond our lifetimes?
A job change and multiple conversations with stressed out nonprofit leaders later, our desire to help nonprofits grow in a healthy and sustainable way was bigger than ever.
If you're a leader at the top or in the middle of a volunteer and donor-based organization, this podcast is for you.
We believe that a better world needs healthier nonprofits, and it's our passion to help you fulfill your organization's mission while helping you live a fulfilled life.
I'm Ted.
And I'm Lisa.
Welcome to the Legacy Builders Movement.
So we're excited to be talking about successful leadership transitions, partly because we're just very encouraged and excited right now. A while ago, maybe a couple years ago, we worked with a nonprofit that was going through a leadership transition. And this was someone at the top of the organization who was actually moving out of the organization, and someone from within the organization was stepping up into it. And we were brought in to help get all of the volunteers and the systems and just make sure things were working before anyone knew that this was happening. I think there were like three of us that knew this was going on. And so we actually started the leadership transition months before the leadership actually made that change. And we were there. We're going to talk about how we helped that to happen. But we went back and we got to go check in on the nonprofit maybe a couple weeks ago now. And it was phenomenal because as far as we could tell, they haven't lost any volunteers. They retained all of their staff, and the organization is bigger now than it was before the transition happened. And if you have been around any leadership transition, the general rule of thumb is that you can expect about a third to a half of your volunteers to leave with the old leader. But that just because that's the rule of thumb, though, doesn't mean that that has to be the rule for your organization. There are ways to do this well, and we want to help you figure out how to do that today.
Yeah, it was super encouraging to say like, okay, this is the plan. We're going to run this system the way that we run systems when we step in to help out with nonprofits. We're just going to look at it from the ground up and figure out how can we bolster and build support structures so that way when the leadership transition happens, it happens in a really healthy way that people aren't feeling like the rug got pulled out from them, that they had a chance to actually acclimate to the idea that things were going to change a little bit. And it was really, really, really good. So like big hats off to that nonprofit for doing a fantastic job. But it was really, really cool to see all of these principles actually work, and then to go back and be like, sweet, they actually worked. and I know a big piece of it is it's going to change from nonprofit to nonprofit, depending on how hard the leadership is willing to work at a smooth and good transition, and not to cut corners and not to assume that they know everything, but to say, nope, we need to actually dig in and figure out where potential hazards lie, where potential things that are going to help a transition be better lie. Where all of our pros and cons to making this happen? Where are strengths and weaknesses to doing a transition?
And the general way that transition happens in nonprofits is not the best way for it to happen. A lot of times it's an afterthought, or it's let's just make the change quick, give someone else the new job title, and we'll just figure it out as we go. And so much of it is done on the fly that doesn't have to be done on the fly. Now, sometimes you might have a leader within your organization who does give like a 2 weeks notice, or something in their life changes and they're no longer to continue with the role. And those transitions will be a shorter amount of time. But with certain people in your organization, if you're paying attention to them and you're listening to what they're saying, you might be able to foresee a future transition that's coming up. For example, if you have someone on your staff who's currently pregnant and you hear her mentioning, I kind of want to be a stay-at-home mom. I'm kind of considering what I'm going to do. I'm kind of considering.
You probably have 6 months to figure this out.
You have probably about 6 months to figure it out. And the good news is, if you start figuring it out with this person and they go on maternity leave and they come back and realize, no, I actually want to continue my job here, you having set up the teams and the systems behind the scenes isn't going to negatively impact the team, because generally it's getting everything working even better. Mm-hmm. It's like when people move houses and they're suddenly like let's clean everything. Let's throw it all away. We don't need to keep half the stuff. We're just going to purge and get rid of everything. And they're like, why didn't I do this earlier? Anytime that there's potential transition, that's a time that you can get things working very, very well. And if the transition doesn't happen, you have a better functioning team anyway. And if the transition does happen, because you've been paying attention and you know it's a possibility, it's going to go much more smoothly. And when it goes more smoothly, there's less stress. And when there's less stress, there's less strife. There's less chance for conflict within your organization and within the leadership of your organization. And that, if you can do it in a healthy way, which takes effort, you can maintain the volunteerism and the integrity of your organization.
Yeah, so let's talk about a couple pitfalls of transitions.
Right.
And then maybe a couple things that are really good rules of thumb strategies that can be implemented for making good, strong, successful leadership transitions.
I think the first pitfall is announcing it too early. I have seen leaders who know that they're going to be done after a certain amount of time. And I understand they go into it saying, well, I don't want to be lying to people. I don't want people to feel blindsided. And they're so concerned about people feeling blindsided that they never stop to consider that announcing the transition before you have a successor in place and before you've made the adequate arrangements makes people feel abandoned. And so the rushing to announce it too fast, too soon, or not giving it adequate time. I mean, let's be honest. By the time someone's transitioning out of a role, they've already been considering this. This feels like old news to them. So by the time they finally get it off their chest and they're starting to communicate it with their key leaders who are going to help put the plan in place, it can feel to them like, I have to tell everyone now because I've let anyone know. But just wait. Like going too fast is one of the biggest pitfalls that I see.
Yeah, it's like, it's not like ripping off a Band-Aid. Like, oh, it's more like ripping off like stitches or something like that shouldn't be ripped off.
Yeah.
It is a meticulous procedure that needs to be done in a way that is smart and takes into account people's feelings and takes into account the relationship side, because it's not just, hey, we're just removing this person whose job role is this and putting in a new person who has the same job title and nothing's going to change. It's like,
Right.
no, there are real friendships involved, especially in nonprofit where everybody's like on the same page and they're vision driven. They're like, yeah, we're making a change in the world together. When those things are in place, you have to admit that there are relational things that are going to happen with this transition. So how can you smooth those over? How can you actually, so you want to make sure that you're taking the amount of time necessary, but you're not doing it way too soon. And now you're running the risk of like, people are like, okay, we know about this transition. When's this actually going to happen? Like it just goes on and on and on. And the leader's like, I know I'm on my way out, but I'm still looking for the right person to possibly come in. And
you don't want it.
And it's like, that makes people eventually just go like, I can't, because
It's exhausting for your volunteers
Yeah.
to tell them you're going to be done and ask them to stay through an emotional transition and prolong it for them any longer than necessary.
Yeah, and everybody knows like the lame duck philosophy thing, whatever that would be, the concept, where it's like on your way out, you're usually not as effective as you were, say, in the beginning, or like senior slump. It's basically senior slump for a leader.
Yeah.
When they know they're on their way out and other people know that they're on their way out, it's kind of like, all right, so we're just sort of in like a awkward holding pattern until we can actually make this transition happen. So you need to be thinking about, how can I make this last the perfect amount of time? Not too short, not too long.
I think the second pitfall, unless you have one you want to talk
I have,
about.
well, I just wanted to kind of along with
Sorry,
that
go for it.
is the not taking long enough with
yeah.
it. And this usually happens because the leadership just held on too long and said like, no, I can do this. And I know I eventually want to be done. And I'm starting to get this feeling like I need to be done. But then they like just hang on. And then they eventually hit a breaking point and they snap. And then they're like, okay, I need to be done in 2 weeks. And now you've only got 2 weeks to make a leadership transition.
The other time that this happens is when there's someone in the middle of an organization that says, I want to be done. And the leadership at the top of the organization lives in pseudo denial.
Oh, yeah.
And they're like,
denial's a big piece of this whole thing.
They kind of have this idea of like, maybe if we make enough changes, they'll stay. instead of saying we need to actually create the plans and execute on the plans in order for them to be able to leave. And so we've seen people give like a month or two of transition time and leadership not take any advantage of it because they're hoping that the person will change their mind. It's like, yeah, if we don't start planning, then it's not going to happen. Or then they might stay longer because they feel bad. Or
they lie to themselves and say like, oh, it probably won't really matter. Like they'll move
won't make
on,
that
but
big
it
of a
probably
difference.
won't really make that big of a difference.
Yeah.
And it's like, if there's any person in any kind of leadership role, especially if they're working with volunteers or donors, or, you know, they have relational connections that are helping your nonprofit to move and to do things, like you want to handle this leadership transition with so much care and so much thought, because it's going to have a huge negative impact if they just disappear one day.
Right. This is like surgical precision.
Yep.
Not a quick, like, rip off a Band-Aid, stick on another Band-Aid. Like, it's a procedure. And if it's not done correctly, it will cause more pain than is necessary. And it can cause a lot of just loss for your organization.
Well, I mean, we talk about it all the time. Trust is so key
Yeah.
with nonprofit work, building trust and actually being trustworthy.
Yeah.
But when you handle a transition poorly by saying, hey, we're going to make a change, and then it just like never seems to be happening, or you don't plan ahead enough, that loses trust with people. They're like, you know what, maybe this leadership isn't actually the kind of leadership I want to follow. And that means that the successor they choose is also not going to be somebody that I want to follow, because I don't trust their ability to make good decisions. So how am I going to know that they're going to make a good decision on who the next person is? I'm out.
Yeah.
And so you got to be thinking, how do I make decisions in a way that builds people's trust by being trustworthy, and by thinking through what are the people who are connected to my organization, what are they thinking about this from the outside? When they they say, wow, he's been in a leadership transition for 2 years. That's like red flags. It's like,
100%.
just hurry up and make a choice at this point.
All right. Second pitfall that I was going to say is assuming that the person who is going to take over your role is going to be the right person to take over the role, or like assuming like the wrong person for the position. So the second pitfall, if I were to word it more clearly, would be to not explore all the options and choose the best person for the role, but choose it based on a leadership hierarchy, based on someone who's already within the team, and not based on the person's actual skills and talents and what's needed for the role. So sometimes when there's a leadership transition, if it's like the leader of the organization, a lot of times people look at it and say like, well, the second in command, whoever's next in the hierarchy, is the natural person to take over the organization. But depending on people's personalities and what they're really good at, sometimes people thrive in their ability to help someone else execute like on their vision. And some people thrive better in a role where they actually get to define the vision and be the spearhead going forward. And assuming that you can just take someone who's next in line in a hierarchy and put them in that lead position now because they've been there longer, or they know what's going on more, or whatever the case may be, it doesn't always work. Similarly, if you have someone within your organization and they have like an admin working alongside them, helping them get stuff done, if that key staff member leaves, I have seen people say, well, the admin already knows all the people, they handle the communication, they already know what's going on. It just makes sense that they would step up and take over leadership. And if you have a very interesting administrative person who just happens to be good at admin but loves leadership and loves that piece of it, that could work, but that is not the case the vast majority of the time. It is not the norm. And so then you end up losing the staff member. You end up with an admin who continues to run things like an admin, even though the team needs that leadership heart and infusion of culture and everything else. And eventually the admin is like, I did not sign up for this role. And I hate it. This is terrible. I'm out. And you end up losing all of the key connectors for that team.
Yeah, that's a huge, huge mistake that people will say. Like, another thing that happens all the time too is like nepotism, right? Like somebody who's in charge and is in a specific situation to be able to have their son or daughter take over doesn't mean that that person's going to be any good at that job.
And even if they are good at that job, if they haven't been properly introduced to the team itself or had time actually serving in the team, it doesn't matter how excellent they are at their job. People will forever look at that person and say, you didn't earn your spot there.
Yeah, you just got that job because you're so-and-so's kid.
And that's a problem. Like,
yeah, that doesn't help.
That's a real thing.
Yeah, they could be super good at it, but now they have to fight against that mindset.
They have to be like triply good at whatever it is if they didn't earn the right to take over the leadership position. It's very, very hard when that happens.
Right. So taking the time to do the due diligence to actually find the right person who's going to have the skills necessary to lead in that area. You know, if it's a team leader, even a volunteer leader, this doesn't have to be like hired staff positions or like top level executives in the nonprofit. Like this could be somebody who's leading a team of 5 people and they're like, hey, I'm moving to California or whatever. Like you need to find a way to make sure that that leader is replaced with somebody who is going to be able to lead those 5 people well. And that in that situation, you want to be thinking about, you know, how good are they at care? They're working with volunteers. What does a volunteer leader need to have? What are the qualities that makes a great volunteer leader? Think about those qualities and then scope out your organization and figure out who is the best fit for that. And if you have to, you can also look outside the organization for like staff members and things like that too. It's a little trickier but you should still plan to have a good interview process, a vetting process, so you know that the qualities that I'm looking for this specific role, and it's not just skills, it's skills and qualities. Like they need to be competent at, you know, and being able to do what they need to do skill wise, but they also need to have the character qualities that you're looking for.
But the level of competence isn't necessarily competent for the team that they're going to be over. Like,
Yeah.
I know someone who used to be over a worship team at a church who didn't know how to play any instruments and couldn't sing. He had enough of an ear that he was able to like help mix and he could like envision it and vision cast to people and communicate really, really well. But if you looked at him, a lot of churches would have been like, who are you? Like, why are you here? You can't even pick up a guitar and play. But it was because his competency was leading creative people. Like massive competency there. And so that competency that was needed for the role of leadership and pastoring for that specific role, he had that in spades. And so it was one of those things that sometimes we think in order for someone to have this role, they have to have the competency of every volunteer under them on the team. Like they should be able to fill every position, every role in order to show that they can lead. But leadership, you don't have to know how to do every single thing. It comes down to other competencies that too often get overlooked because it's like, if you are the best at X, you should lead X. And that's not necessarily the case. A lot of times it's not the case, because that can actually create an issue where that person knows that they're the best at it. And then they have a hard time leading because they have a hard time delegating and bringing other people in, and it causes other issues.
Yeah, I can't remember which book it is. I think it was one of those books that's more like written like a story. So like the 1 Minute Manager. I can't remember the guy's name right now. If you know, put it in the comments. But the idea was that most really, really great leaders are not very competent skill-wise within the organization. What they are extremely competent in is leadership and working with people. And so they're able to gather the people who have the skill competencies and the other competencies required, and they're able to lead them and manage them really, really, really well. And you can see how that quickly turns into, well, instead of having like one person who's Superman, now you've got the Justice League, and you've got all these different specialties, and you got people who can actually do what needs to get done. And you have, you know, you can be like 3 places at once, 4 places at once.
Yeah.
And so sometimes one of the things you might want to look at is like, who doesn't have the skills for in this team, but who does have the skills to lead this team?
That should always be like what you're asking. And you might be surprised at who you bring in versus the person that feels like there might be the obvious choice.
Yeah.
Because sometimes the obvious choice, they could be, or it could be something that's actually detrimental for one of the reasons that we mentioned. Let's talk through how to actually set up a good transition, though.
Yes.
This part, I think we'll kind of get through a little bit quicker. But I'd say first and foremost, you have to figure out the timeline.
It's going to be different for different organizations, different positions.
Yeah, regardless of if you even know who the incoming leader is, you need to know the timeline for the outgoing leader. Whether that timeline is 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, I would not recommend 2 years. If you're looking at being done in an organization,
If you're thinking 2 years, you should probably make it sooner. Because
Yeah.
2 years is a long time.
2 years is a long time. Once you take those glasses off, because you know you're ready to be done, it's hard to put them back on. But you need to figure out the timeline for the person that's leaving. This will help inform how you're going to handle the incoming leadership, whether it's going to be someone in the interim, or if you're able to actually go through and find the person that's going to be taking over that position, that team, or whatever it might be for the long term.
Right. So if this leader is like, hey, I've got 1 month, I could maybe do 2 months. Don't say, okay, we'll do 2 months. Say we'll do 1 month. Like if they're like, hey, I have 9 months in me to be able to make sure that we have a good transition. If we really need to, I can go a year. Say, nope, we'll make it 9 months. Like we're not going to stretch this any longer than is going to feel as comfortable as possible, because that 9 months is going to be really hard too. It's not like it gets really hard after the 9 months. That whole process is going to be extremely exhausting for the person who's on their way out.
It gets hard from the moment that they bring this up. It starts being hard right then. And the longer that you prolong this process, especially beyond their minimum, the more likely it is that there's going to be a really bad separation and you're going to lose that relationship and that connection for the future. They might be leaving your organization, but that doesn't mean that you have to lose that personal connection over time. Like you can still maintain that. But the longer that transition happens, especially if they give you a window, if you go to the higher end of that window, you're just increasing the chance that's not going to go well.
Then from that moment on, once you've kind of like, okay, we've got a timeline established of what's looking like, that person's job, that leader's job, maybe it's your job, maybe you're looking at transitioning out. Your new job description is handling the transition well, doing the plan, and working within the timeline. Like that's your new job description. Your job description is not make things run as normal for a little while and then start working. Like, no, the transition plan starts on day one. And if day one says business as normal for day one, then that's fine. But your new job description is running the plan.
Your job is also not to start giving your ideas on how things could be run better. Like with all due respect,
You're
if you
leaving.
are on your way out, that's a sign that for whatever reason, the position is no longer working. And if you knew something that would have made it better, you maybe should have already implemented it, or you don't actually know it's going to make it better and you're trying to throw out ideas. We understand this. And we've seen it many times through many transitions with many different organizations and people. But this is one of those things that it just confuses the person coming in when they're just trying to figure out how everything works, when you're suddenly throwing in like 5 or 6 different other ideas
Yeah, new curveballs
that haven't actually been implemented yet. And if you start trying to implement new ideas, you're going to confuse your volunteers right before a transition happens. No, they don't know the transition is happening yet, but you will start causing confusion because suddenly there's this massive change. They're going to feel uneasy about it. And then when the new leader steps in, they're going to view the uneasiness as the new leader's fault. So we don't want to do that. The second thing that you can be doing in this season is record every single thing that you do. Every part of your job, write it out step by step. Here's how I do this. Here's how I schedule this. Here's how I update this. Here's what communication currently looks like. Really, if you already had this written out, which we recommend with all of your teams, it just makes more sense because it ends up being a transition manual and a training manual. But if you don't have it yet, this is a great time to do it so that you're setting yourself up in the best possible way. You're setting up the next leader in the best possible way, and it makes things much more smooth.
Yeah. And I would say another really, really good trick for running a successful leadership transition is bring in an outside leadership coach that can help with the transition.
Yeah.
Because your organization has blind spots because it's an echo chamber for yourself. You cannot see potential problems like someone from the outside, especially someone who has a lot of experience, can look from the outside and say, here are the problem areas. Here are the things that are going to really be an issue with this transition. So we're going to head these things off at the pass. We're going to make sure that this is bolstered up. This is taken out. Maybe this part of the project needs to just go out, just leave right now. So that way, when the person comes in, they can handle what is coming at them. Like, and if you are trying to do this all on your own as an organization, you're going to miss a ton of stuff.
Yeah.
And you're going to have to do a lot of cleanup.
Yeah.
So
It's
bringing
just-
in a consultant or a coach that can help with transitions is huge.
Yeah, they'll spot the issues beforehand, and so there'll be less cleanup to do on the back end of all of this. Second thing with transition in that timeline, make sure that you know when the public transition is happening versus the private transition. So what I mean by that, let's say you're in an organization right now, you know that you're stepping out and it's been a couple weeks, but now you have found the person who's going to be taking over the role, right? Right there, day one, it's not the time to start announcing the transition. That person has not been trained on the role. They don't know the role.
They may not know any of the people.
They might not know any of the people. If you announce on that day, like, hey, just so you know, I'm going to be leaving. This person's going to be taking over. And then they're there for 3 months. It starts them off in a very weak position. And people look at them and say, they're not capable of doing this because they're seeing them fumble through the learning process.
Yeah, it's not a safe environment for there to learn.
It feels better for the person leaving to announce it earlier. A lot of times they want to, but it's more hurtful for the organization for that to be the case. So we want to know when the private transition is. All right, we have the person. Here's how we're going to start. You can slowly start handing off certain roles, and then that person can start taking over little pieces with the language like, yeah, I'm just stepping in order to give more support to this team. So I'm going to start handling some of this communication, or I'm going to start overseeing this project, or I'm going to start whatever the next thing is, and allowing them to get to know the people and start building the stuff there. And then down the road, when you have the public transition, if this has been done well, you'll actually have volunteers within the organization going, why is that other person still leading? This person's been here so much in the last couple months and getting to know us. I almost feel like they're our leader.
They're ready to take over
And
right
by
now.
the time it's announced, people are like, oh, this makes sense. Yeah.
And they feel good about it
And they
instead
feel
of-
really good about it.
Now, it's also really important, like when you have private things that then become public, it is important to acknowledge that that's what was going on.
Yeah.
Like we don't mean like private, like lie about it and then tell the truth about it. It just means keep it under lock and key. This is not this can be really damaging to the whole organization, to a lot of people's relationships and they can feel abandoned and all that stuff. So it's good to keep it under lock and key. But then when you say, okay, publicly, we're going to announce this transition, you can say, hey, this is something we've been working on for a couple months at this point. People will probably kind of know that something's
They'll look
up.
back and be like,
But if you come out and you start with honesty, this builds trust. You say, we've been working on this for a couple months. I've been getting this feeling like I need to move on into a different thing or whatever it might be. And that's why we've been trying to handle with so much care this new person being taught how to do this and make sure they have all the tools and all the support that they need to be able to run this organization or run this team.
yeah, we talk about trust being a thing. It's like the thing for nonprofits, right? And sometimes at the beginning, when you know transition is coming up, people be like, but it's lying to not tell them right away. But it's not. Like, there's a certain point where we have to recognize that there are some things that are meant to be public right away, but there are certain things that need to be handled as leaders for the sake of the organization. And this isn't meant to be deceitful or to hide it, but it's to give it proper timing. It's like my kids, if we have something going on with our home that's kind of goofy, I can either wake them up in the morning and be like, oh my gosh, this thing may or may not be going wrong. I'll let you know in a couple weeks. Or we can kind of feel it out for a couple weeks. And if we need to, sit down and be like, all right, so we've been having this little bit of an issue. We kind of wanted to wait and see how it was going to go because we didn't want you to worry about it. So here's where we're at now. We just wanted to fill you in. It's not lying to them in order to minimize like their stress about it and their uncertainty.
I would say too, it's a lot like relationships. I mean, because so much of nonprofit is built on relationships, we've all been in situations where we have people who overshare or other people that like the relationship naturally becomes built stronger over time as people begin to like exchange trust and exchange back and forth. So there is a certain part of this where it's like, if you know a transition is coming, there's a point where it is oversharing and it actually erodes trust to say what's all the things that are going through your head too.
There's also a point where it's undersharing, and that is when the public transition happens and you make it sound as if it's a short-term thing. Like, yeah, so we're just announcing now that they've decided to step out. So yeah, it's gonna be like 2 weeks. Versus being honest and saying, yep, we've honestly known that this has been coming up for about 3 or 4 months. You might have noticed some changes, and we did this because we care about the teams, the volunteers, the organization. We wanted to make sure this was run as well as possible, and also make sure that we found the right person to step into this role. So you might have noticed some stuff, but we want to share, this is what's happening and this is why. And you can share a proper amount, but part of that is acknowledging a longer timeline. Because otherwise, if you make it sound like it was just a couple week thing and people start looking back, you're gonna be like,
that doesn't line up with what I was experiencing. This person showed up 4 months ago. Why are you saying this was only a couple weeks? Yep.
So another thing to make a transition work. So we have our timeline, you know, when the private transition starts and when the public transition starts. Figure out how the new leader or the incoming leader is going to need the teams to be run and start making small tweaks in the meantime so that they are set up for success. So with one organization in particular, when we were in there helping them through transition, we were specifically there to help get all of the systems and teams set up in a way that would best support the incoming leader. Because the previous leader or the outgoing leader and the incoming leader had different leadership styles. They had different things that they needed. They're just different people.
Different life situations. Like the newer leader had like really, really young kids. The older leader had like older kids that were kind of moving out. So it's like very different life situations.
Yeah. So all of these things had to be taken into account. And so as we started working with the teams and prepping things for the leader that was coming in, it was really important that we knew exactly what they needed as we were walking into it. And this is something that organizations a lot of times think that the systems work outside the leader. It's like, we can just pull out this leader and pop in a new leader and it'll all just keep working. But with the systems, depending on how that leader operates, the same system doesn't always work for everyone. But then also so much of it is relationship based. And you have to give a new leader time in order to start fostering and developing those those relationships.
Yeah, because so much of a leader's ability to do things is built on the relationships that they have. They might be best friends with a guy who's in construction who will just like help them do whatever they need to do construction wise within the nonprofit. But the new leader might be best friends with somebody who like does signage and marketing stuff. Right. So right there, it's an obvious change where like we can get marketing resources way easier now than we are able to get construction resources just because of the relationships that were built up. And so taking those things into account, that goes across the board. There are tons of different skill proficiencies and connections that people have that you need to say, like, what are the resources that we currently have? And what are the resources that we're going to lose potentially and gain? And then make a point A and a point Z and figure out how to get from point A to point Z.
Yeah. Now, speaking of that, another thing that will help the transition is start to figure out who those people are in the organization that the incoming leader needs to be introduced to. This is not a conversation where you're necessarily telling them that there's a transition happening. But if I was an outgoing leader and Ted was an incoming leader, and I had a key volunteer on the team who led all of the stuff, I would suggest that the three of us go out to lunch. And at that lunch, I'm going to talk to the person, introduce them to Ted, talk up Ted, help them to get to know each other, let them have a conversation, and just start facilitating the handoff of that leadership relationship dynamic. This doesn't mean that I'm going to suddenly hand it off completely and ignore that person going forward, nor am I going to overshare what's happening. But it is starting to realize if I have these relationships with these five key people for the organization, rather than Ted having to come in and find 5 brand new people or whatever the case may be, I'm sorry, I can actually help facilitate the changeover in those in that leadership transition.
That's good.
By helping him get a good foot in with those people. We've seen certain leaders be like, oh, if you need something, just call Phil. He'll help build it. I don't know Phil can build stuff. It's like,
I don't know Phil.
I don't know. Well, he helps us all the time. Just call him. It's like, but I don't know him. Me calling Phil is going to be a stranger cold calling someone, asking them to volunteer. Like the connection,
for free.
The connection doesn't always transfer over just because it's a part of the organization.
Absolutely. And so, taking that into account and saying, how can we smooth out the relational handoff as well as the leadership handoff?
Yeah.
And that's something that's really different between business, the business sector and the nonprofit sector, is you have these relational things that are extremely important in nonprofit that need to be handled and can't just be systemized necessarily. And so having that plan, following that all the way through, there's so much more we could talk about this, but we're getting close to the end of the episode. So if you would like to send us a transition that your organization is going through right now, and you just want to get something off your chest or ask questions, we would love to hear from you. We always love to hear from our listeners. You can send us an email at office@legacybuildersintl.com. Thanks for listening to the Legacy Builders Movement. If you appreciate this podcast and find that it's valuable, the best way that you could help us is to subscribe and leave us a rating and review.
To learn more about Legacy Builders, go to legacybuildersinternational.com. That's legacybuildersintl.com.